So here's my May by the numbers. 8 books finished, 3 genres, average rating of 4.125, 0 5-star reads, 1 DNF, and one part of this video where I get into a little bit of a tangent of audiobook versus physical book. So for that and more, stay tuned. Hey everyone, and welcome to my May book roundup. I'm going to share with you short reviews and ratings for everything that I read this month. As I mentioned, 8 books, 3 different genres. I always group everything by genre below, and I always save my book of the month for last, so you can look forward to that. My DNF this month, unfortunately, was Memories of Ice by Steven Erikson. If you want to see more details for that, I'll put the link up here for the vlog that I shot. I was disappointed to DNF that 500 pages in, but I just really was not enjoying it whatsoever, and it was just time. But let's talk about the things that I did read this month, because overall, despite having not any books that reached 5 stars for me, this was a really solid month of just a lot of great 4-star reads. Starting with, let's start in historical fiction with Taipan by James Clavell. So James Clavell wrote 6 books known as the Asian Saga. This is the second one written and also the second one in chronological kind of in-world order. And this deals with the founding of Hong Kong in the mid-19th century. And it has to do with kind of merchant groups, rivals that are trying to get their foothold on trade in Asia. And it has a lot to do with, just like Shogun, the other work of the Asian Saga that I've read by Clavell, a lot of this kind of cross-cultural clash, cross-cultural connection and learning. And that aspect of the book I just absolutely loved. And that's why I'm pretty positive that I'm probably going to love all 6 of these books in this Asian Saga, because I do love that. I love to learn, and I love seeing characters learn in books as well. And you see that on both sides of this, the Eastern and the Western characters learning from each other. This also has a lot of great things in here. There are some great father-son relationships in here. It's tightly plotted, and when I thought back upon the book when I finished it, there's so much that goes on in here. There's aspects of thriller, there's some romance aspects, there's a lot of political machinations going on, there's a lot of nautical things going on. There's just a whole lot going on in this book, and it's not as good as Shogun, in my opinion. Maybe a little better plotted, but overall, I really enjoyed it. The one thing that it held back for me is I don't like nautical settings. And I found a lot of this just being on ships and dealing with that was just less than compelling for me. But overall, this was a very good read. The ending of this is triumphant. I mean, it'll kind of gut you a little bit at the end. It was just one of those like, wow, kind of endings to this book. A couple things at the end happened that just, my jaw dropped. But I really enjoyed Taipan. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5. Okay, on to the horror genre next, starting with One Girl in All the World by Kendare Blake. This is set in the world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So it's not a traditional horror because it has a lot of the same kind of, I guess, kind of snarky humor and wit that the show had, although this is a bit different. This is the second of a trilogy, and I read the first one. I remember very clearly I read it at the outset of the pandemic, because I listened to it as I was taking walks around the neighborhood just to get out of the house. Well, this series would prove to be the absolute perfect way to reboot Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the show, because it's kind of a next generation. It follows Frankie, who is Willow's daughter, and Willow and a lot of the other kind of young protagonists in the original series are now older, and the actors can play themselves. So it would be a perfect reboot, but I know Joss Whedon's stock isn't very high in Hollywood right now, so that's probably not going to happen. But I am really enjoying this series because I do love the Buffyverse. I did enjoy that show quite a bit. I found that it had a whole lot more heft than I expected it to have. And these books are pretty good. There's one aspect of this book, though, I want to talk about in regards to audiobook listening. So a little bit of a tangent, but it's related to this. So I was about halfway through this book, and I realized that I was feeling like most of the characters spoke with the same voice. And it made me start to think about, okay, is this a result of just a poor narrator, or is it the author just isn't great at characterization so that all the dialogue kind of feels the same, especially amongst the teenagers in the story? And I couldn't find a conclusion. So it made me really think about the delivery system of this book that I'm reading it through my ears. I'm listening to the audiobook. And I think that is one inherent flaw to listening to an audiobook rather than reading a book with your eyes. Now, listen, I am not someone that says that audiobook is not reading or anything like that. I don't believe that. The audiobooks that I listen to, they go onto my book count for the year as well. So I'm not one of those people that draws a line in the sand and says that audiobook listening is not reading. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that it is not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to get the same experience. I don't know if it's better or worse. I would personally say worse. Here's why I would say worse, but I may be wrong on this. This is just my opinion. When you read a book with your eyes, the author's words are going directly to you to interpret what they are saying. When you are listening to an audiobook, there's a middleman where the person narrating the audiobook is interpreting. So you are either listening to someone else's interpretation of the text, or you are, even more than that, interpreting somebody else's interpretation of the text. And I feel that if I were reading this with my eyes, I might have been able to determine what I was talking about with character voice, whether this was an author thing or a narrator thing, because that narrator wouldn't have been in the equation. So maybe it would have been something I noticed or not. But it's just something I've been thinking about with audiobooks, and it's one reason why some audiobooks I want to gravitate to, because I do about one a month. First-person memoirs or books read by authors, I think, are perfect audiobooks. But I'm kind of hesitant with a lot of other books getting a narrator's interpretation rather than what the author's intent is. I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. Let me know. Back to the book. I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't, it's not mind-blowing. It's not cutting edge, because a lot of things are kind of rehashed from the show. Just like the new Slayer, Frankie, she has to have a love interest that's a demon. And anyway, there are aspects of it I don't like, but I like how this told a good story, but it really set up the third book very well. One Girl in All the World by Kendari Blake, I gave a 3.5 out of 5. The other work in the horror genre I read this month is Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin. This was the book that Jimmy from the Fantasy Network picked for me as part of my last TBR. And this is an old school vampire tale. Kind of. What I liked most about this book is the writing. It's not peak Martin because it's earlier Martin, but you see so many elements in this book of what he was going to become in A Song of Ice and Fire. Namely, the plotting is very good. There's only one spot where I felt it kind of dragged, but I felt it was pretty well paced throughout. But even more than that, he subverts your expectations so well. And that's one of the best parts, I think, of A Song of Ice and Fire, is those times where something shocking happens that you don't see coming. And in this book, it's not any of those big red wedding shocking moments or anything like that. But just when you think the story's going one direction, it went a different direction a few times. And I really like that. I love it when an author is able to subvert my expectations about a book. Now, this wasn't a book that my expectations, I think, were incorrect. I was thinking this was going to be kind of an old school vampire tale set along the Mississippi, maybe set in New Orleans for a lot of it. And it really wasn't. A lot of this is really a nautical story, even though vampires, of course, are at the forefront of this tale. And for me, that's one reason why this couldn't get a top rating, is I don't like nautical settings as a rule. When they're done really well, live ship traders, things like that, I of course will love them. But overall, it's not my favorite kind of thing. I just don't see the allure of the sea as something that I gravitate to as a reader. And a lot of this was on these steamboats, and it got a little tedious for me at times. But overall, I really enjoyed this. This is a very memorable read. I can definitely recommend this. The only reason that it's not a top rating for me is because of the nautical setting of the story. I gave Fever Dream a 4 out of 5. All right, next into some classic fantasy, starting with The Horse and His Boy by C.S. Lewis. So this is what I picked up immediately after my DNF of Memories of Ice, and I had been reading in tandem the Malazan books and the Narnia books, and it was just a great kind of change of pace. And I was feeling kind of down after the DNF because I don't like to quit things. And this picked me right back up because it's so delightful. And this was the 5th book written, although it's the 3rd one in the chronology. And each of the 5 books, I just felt that C.S. Lewis just kept getting better as an author. What I didn't like of a lot of the earlier books, even Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is still my favorite of the entire series, he just goes off on these tangents and these little things that don't keep the story very focused. Well, I thought this was a very focused story. The Horse and His Boy has to do with a boy who's a slave as well as a horse who's kind of an indentured servant. Talking horse, of course, because it's Narnia, but they're in Archenland, which is south of Narnia. And they try to escape to get to Narnia, where the talking horse can be among, his brethren, and the little boy can become free. And they meet some other characters along the way. And even though early on, I knew exactly where it was going to go. I mean, it's a Moses allegory, and I could tell exactly where every character was going to end. I still liked it a lot. It was really enjoyable. It was, again, one of the more focused of these Narnia tales. This was the 5th one I read. I'd say 3 of the 5 were extremely focused narratives, and this was one of them. I gave The Horse and His Boy a 4 out of 5. Now, the next one I'm going to talk about was on my June TBR, but I started it May 31st, and I read it in one sitting because I thought it was just so good, and that is The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. So this is the 6th book written, and it is the 1st book in the chronology, but do not read it first. I'll talk about that in a minute. And what I mentioned about Horse and His Boy, how I felt like Lewis is getting better and his narrative was getting tighter, but this exceeded both of those things in A Horse and His Boy. This was one very focused story with little to no fat and little to no tangents that didn't add up to the whole narrative. And this also just was very magical, and I felt that was a great lead-in to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So you must start with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't care that this says number 1. C.S. Lewis scholars are split on this fact, and they keep citing this letter that he wrote to a little boy about the narrative. This is true, but this is not the place to start, because Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's so magical entering Narnia via Lucy's eyes and the wardrobe. This ruins that magical moment because you see the origins of Narnia, including the wardrobe and the lamppost and all of those things that are, I think, better appreciated having read this after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you disagree, I'd love to talk with you about it, but I think you're wrong. I really think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the best entry point for Narnia. But this was fantastic. I think this is actually a better book. So if that's your argument, I'll let you have that. I think this is one of the best books in the series. I gave The Magician's Nephew a 4.5 out of 5. All right, the next 2 books are from this omnibus up here from Elric of Melniboné, the Elric Saga Volume 1. I read the last 2 novels in this collection, The Sailor on the Seas of Fate and The Weird of the White Wolf. Now, the Sailor on the Sea of Fate, I think it's singular. Sailor on the Sea of Fate. It's sea or seas. I'm not sure. One or the other, whichever one it was, that was my favorite in that omnibus. What I like most about this, so fantasy kind of became codified for a while, where publishers mostly forced authors into this little niche where everything was like Tolkien, where it was this other world and everything fit into that world. Well, this is much different because Moorcock had a multiverse, and you see it very clearly in this book. I'd heard about his multiverse as well as his eternal champions and all the different stories he told. He has a different eternal champion. that are the champions of the different worlds in this multiverse, of which Elric is one. And you see Elric interact with some of these. I found it fascinating. It made me think about kind of the roots of the genre pre-Tolkien. I'm reading right now some short stories up here. This is Conan's Brethren by Robert E. Howard. And there were these stories from Kull the Conqueror. And he's kind of a Conan type character, this barbarian. But my favorite of all the stories of those, there's one that involves time travel. And it just shows that before fantasy kind of went into this one direction, there were just a lot of different elements from a lot of different places. There was a much more blurring of a line between fantasy and science fiction, I feel, at the time. And this kind of harkened back to that because, of course, it's very famous that Moorcock did not want to go down the road that Tolkien paved. So I really enjoyed this one. It was my favorite of the three, and I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. The final book in that omnibus was The Weird of the White Wolf, and this you can very clearly see some of the roots of grimdark fantasy, because in the first book of the 3 books in The Weird of the White Wolf, this got very dark. A lot darker than I expected the series to go. I really did not think that the act that happened in this book was going to happen. Didn't see it coming, and it was kind of shocking. My biggest flaw with this book is it was 3 books and they felt very disjunct, especially the third book almost felt disconnected from the previous 2. And the first book had this really dark act, and I wanted Moorcock to really explore that from Elric's character standpoint, and he didn't. I come to find at the end of the omnibus, there's an afterword or something like that. It's a little article about the genesis of all of the Elric novels. And it turns out that a lot of these novels were originally novellas that Moorcock kind of put together. And that explains so much of why I feel like the storytelling is just so disjunct and so inconsistent. I still think it's very good. But it explained in this one, the one that started with such promise and then I think ended in a totally different story. I understand now why it ended up like that. Overall, I still enjoyed it. I have more Elric planned next month. I'm really enjoying these short novels of Michael Moorcock. I gave The Weird of the White Wolf a 4 out of 5. And on to my book of the month. My book of the month was A Darkness at Sethanon by Raymond E. Feist. This is the conclusion of the Rift War saga. I'm not going to talk much. Later this month, I want to do a video why you should read the Rift War saga, but let me give you just a few thoughts on the series as a whole and why this was my book of the month. First of all, the trilogy spans about 12 years, and the character development over the 12 years is fantastic. You don't get to see that very often in fantasy. I mean, some exceed that, like what we saw in Realm of the Elderlings, but you don't get to see that where at the very beginning of Magician you have 3 young boys and then they are adults at the end of this series, and you see what they become and you can reflect upon their journey, and I really love their journey. This book, what I liked again about the trajectory when I was talking about Silverthorn, I loved how like the big bad was kind of the B story, but it comes to the forefront here. There are some great battles. In this series as a whole, there are 2 brilliant battle sequences that will stick in my brain as just being 2 of those indelible scenes of fantasy that I've enjoyed. I did feel a little too much military fantasy in this one, but again, that was me just being really sensitive from DNFing Memories of Ice this month for that very reason. But look for that video for me in probably a week or 2, why you should read the Rift War saga, because I think it is a work of fantasy that's worth your time, and I really enjoyed it. I gave A Darkness at Sethanon a 4.5 out of 5, and I'm looking forward to continuing in this world with the Empire trilogy starting in July. So that was my May. What did you read this month? What was your favorite book in the month of May? And if you've read any of these books and want to talk about it in the comments, I'd love to talk with you about it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.